Game world or real world, seatbelts save lives.
There were two guys. Neither guy wore their seatbelt. One guy got a ticket, one guy didn't. Two guys drove home from work. One guy wore his seatbelt, one guy didn't. One guy made it home. One guy didn't.
Hello there, everybody, and welcome to the 2023 Esports Invitational presented by NHTSA and Click It or Ticket recap show, because during the games themselves, we only get to talk about so much, but we've got a whole lot to talk about today. I'm talking the groups, the brackets, the MVPs, the player movements, and futures of these teams. We've got a whole lot to cover, and that's why I'm not here alone. I am here with two Rocket League experts, Chixa and Bass, and I'm just super excited to have you guys here with us. I think we've got a lot of a really good conversation ahead of us.
Yeah, we had 8 phenomenal teams start off. Of course, only one of them won it all big, but it's been really cool to see the competition. I like to highlight this as kind of a practice for them coming into CRO Worlds, which was this weekend. So this had a lot of merit throughout the teams to really practice, get going, have some nice competition, and overall just have fun, play, and support a good cause.
On top of that, it's also a last hurrah for a lot of these teams as well. Not all of these teams have been able to qualify for CRO Worlds, and on top of that, a lot of these teams are going to be changing going into next year. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on in the show, but it really was a final showcase for a lot of these teams to sort of show what they have got, and a huge shout out again to NHTSA for putting this one on and for being able to provide this for ESportsU, considering the fact that, again, a lot of these teams kind of went into CECC, the prior LAN that we had here for ESportsU, thinking it was their last hurrah. They get one more, and, well, it was quite the show.
Yeah, this was a very cool kind of last chance that a lot of these teams got to have in terms of, like you said, playing with the rosters they have now. We're going to be discussing those critical roster changes and a lot of the ones we're seeing for the future. But these teams got a very cool last hurrah. They got a very cool last moment. And the coolest thing about it is this was, I think, different in a lot of positive ways than the traditional brackets they're playing in. It didn't carry that same kind of terminal weight on top of them. There was a lot of play and intended chaos on top of this that I think made it a very fun experience for them as well.
We're talking about chaos. Let's talk about the grand finals here. We're not going to spoil the results quite yet here, but that is probably one of the most climactic ends I have ever seen to an event, literally ever. So, yeah, we got a lot for you guys in store here today. I think I'm more excited about than anything to just kind of dive into it. Although, Seb, we do have to, kind of recap this one maybe a little bit more before we get too far in.
Yeah, definitely. So we've got to talk about kind of the groups, how they existed and how they became to be what they are, because ESportsU is kind of beginning to use the same strategy and the same tiering over and over, putting these teams into groups. X amount of teams move forward into the bracket. And this time, having so few teams, we had, I believe, 4 groups, and then it was only 4 teams into the bracket. So things get a little bit interesting there. It was 2 groups, I think. I'm losing my mind. I'm so sorry. And I've got 8 extra teams that don't exist in my head right now. But the point is 4 teams do make it on to play into kind of the bracket. And then it goes into the GSL format. And all of a sudden you're down to 2. And Bass, as you've already hinted, we get one of the craziest series I think we've seen in a very long time that I too am super excited to talk about. But I think the general kind of first question here, and not to lead too far into the future, is going into this, if you guys hadn't known the outcome of this, which were the teams that stood out to you immediately and you thought, okay, them being here is going to be a big problem for their opponents?
Well, I mean, you obviously laser focus on the eyes of Northwood, no matter what their roster is. Is it blue? Is it white? Is it a combination of whatever? It doesn't matter, because Northwood time and time again shows that they are the roster to beat. They are the top tier of collegiate esports. And I mean, we focus a lot on Lime Blaze Buddy Hockey, but I know we saw even during the tournament, we could spoil it a little more later, the roster moved around a little bit to who was available, and that still didn't matter because they are just the mark to beat when it comes to CRO.
And we're talking about this again, with the CRO World Championship going on this weekend here. There's all players, or I would say a plethora of players that participated in this event that are at that championship, including, like you said, that Northwood roster. And both of the Northwood rosters. That's right. If you didn't know, Northwood is not only so good that they have a top team competing within Collegiate Rocket League, they also have a second top team competing within Collegiate Rocket League. So for all the players that participated in the weekend, like you said, with a little bit of roster shuffle here or there, it did give them a little bit of practice, a little bit of warm-up going into this LAN environment upcoming, along with a couple of the other teams that were here. Stockton, another familiar face that is actually at the World Championship competing right now. So this really was a very interesting event to use as a preview, especially considering there are a couple of teams that made it close to the World Championship but didn't quite get in that also participated in this. So again, it's a little bit of a litmus test. If you can get past the people who are able to just barely miss out, you might be able to compete on that World Championship stage.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I think Northwood is a really fascinating program because you guys both kind of talk about this. They're one of very few schools across any esports that I'm involved in that you can easily swap out a player, swap out two players, and the talent does not change. They continue to play at that echelon. You look at schools like Fisher as well that has multiple teams, but Fisher doesn't carry that same caliber. If you do swap a player out, you will see the wobble a little bit. You will see things get a little shaky, but I feel like that's something we've never really seen with Northwood. And then that team, that's part of the reason they've become kind of this giant of collegiate Rocket League, right? Is because the team truly, no matter which three are in, seem untouchable.
I mean, honestly, if you really want to reference that, let's just talk about the fact that next year we're not even quite sure what the roster is. Again, we'll get into that a little bit later on to talk more about that Northwood roster, but it really is interesting. I'm friends with a lot of the people who work on that Northwood team, both the coaches, the managers, the players, all in between, and they're talking about how they've got new recruit X and another recruit that they're looking at Y, and there's just like a million people who they're all going to be slotting in and out. No matter what roster that they have, Northwood is a team to watch. But again, we've got a lot of other teams to talk about here today. 8 entered, 4 got into the playoff stage, and only 1 of them walked away the champion. So, we can theorize all day, but I think we got a lot of teams to talk about and a lot of games to go over.
Well, Bess, I love that you say that because that leads perfectly into my next question, of course, being we had these teams. We've talked about the expected grades, right? Were there any teams in this matchup, in these games, where you kind of saw somebody step up? Did anybody punch notably above their weight during this matchup and you were really excited to see it? Or if you want to go the other side, did anybody underperform? That is something we can talk about as well. Was there an underperformance from any of these teams?
I would say the closest thing we get to an underperformance, and you will see this as we go through the group stage sort of breakdown here, would probably be IRSC. Indian River State College is one of the most notable teams in all of Collegiate Rocket League, and to understand how incredibly heartbreaking this team has been all year, they have had 3 championships to qualify for the Collegiate Rocket League World Championship, the official tournament put on by Psyonix, and they failed in all 3 instances. They were as close as a single game away from being able to qualify and were unable to 3 times through. So again, we talk about Litmus Test. This is a team that is very, very solid. They looked really good coming up to this event, but unfortunately, due to a single change in the roster, Disruptor having to play instead of Seabass, a former RLCS pro with a myriad of accolades behind him. Unfortunately, he actually retired going into this offseason. He is no longer going to be competing in both collegiate and professional Rocket League. So IRSC, after the player had already left, had to try and regain here, as you guys can see in the East groups, and didn't quite do that. As much as we might have wanted to see this team level up to what we were expecting, Disruptor just couldn't quite slot into this roster. And despite Slayer and Taco Stash being 2 of the best players that CRL has to offer, it's a bit difficult when you're up against a titan, a veteran in UTA.
Right, yeah, so Bass, I think you bring up a really fascinating point. Of course, is Disruptor being swapped in for Seabass, who's already gone into retirement, who wasn't here to play? What is the fundamental issue that comes for a team of 3 swapping out a player in a circumstance like that? Was it Seabass's talent that just carried the team and the other 2 were happy to ride on the back of it? Was it the team dynamic and the comfortability, the synergy they had from playing together so long? Or is it just that wild card of someone new coming in and you have to start all the way from square one?
Ooh, for me, I think it's the dynamic of the team here. I think that's probably the best way to look at this one, is that IRSC are very much a team that likes their rules and they stick very closely to them. We've talked about this a lot of different times, whether it's on this broadcast, whether it's on CRL broadcast, whether it's somewhere in between. Slayer is arguably the best 2nd or 3rd man in all of Collegiate Rocket League, whether it is in main games or whether it is in competitions all across the field. He is a really good player when it comes to backing up his teammates. You'll see this very often where Taco Stash and Seabass will be the 2-headed Hydra who dive into their opponents, get them uncomfortable, and as soon as there's a little bit of an opening, you see Slayer dive in from midfield to try and clean up the pieces, get a goal, or do something to at least continue and extend that offensive play. The issue is, when you take out Seabass, you kind of have to put Disruptor into that role, but if Disruptor's not that confident because, he's the sub, he's the new player, you need to be able to have somebody who can sort of take that role over and play either A, front man to replace Seabass, or B, someone to allow Slayer to play that front man and then have him sort of control the midfield. Without Disruptor really being able to pick up either of those roles too confidently, you could see many breakdowns. And again, you saw it in the replays where there were moments where IRSC just didn't really have anybody back. That never happens when you see that original trio. So, unfortunately, I think a lot of it really was role-playing and just sort of the rotations that the team had. They were so set in their ways and so very key on playing a certain rotation that when Disruptor has to slot in and doesn't quite live up to those expectations, the whole team kind of falls apart.
Yeah, so Bess, I love what you're saying. Chicks, I was hearing a lot of agreement from you, so I do want to
Yeah.
ask this next question to kind of get another analysis on it. Going into a circumstance like this, you've got Slayer, you've got Taco Stash. They have their roles, they're darn good at them, but Seabass, arguably the star player of the team, is the one that needs subbed out. Do you think it's more effective to have somebody swap into Seabass's role, like Slayer or Taco Stash, that's a little more familiar with the game, and have Disruptor play a third man? Or do you think it can be more effective for the team long run to go ahead and force Disruptor kind of trial by fire in a tournament like this, in an invitational like this that does allow that room for experimentation?
I mean, you can't force a player into a role they can't play. I mean, I
Very
don't
true.
know
Facts.
Disruptor's abilities when it comes down to it. Like, I haven't watched that much of him because he is newer to this scene. But if he can't be Seabass or doesn't play like Seabass, then they have to figure out a style of chemistry that works using him in rotation. I mean, in those group stages, he really got nearly half the points of both Taco
Yeah.
Stash and Slayer. I mean, I think there was a game where we said he only had 42. Like,
Dang.
it was rough.
Yes.
He wasn't even getting ball touches. He just felt lost when it came down to it on the field. And in the games they did win, he had that impact. They saw he either was upfield for goals or got the amount of saves that he needed. They just need more time with Disruptor when it comes down to it. If he is going to be that third fill, he needs to get better. They need to figure out a chemistry, what works together. And I mean, maybe it isn't the fill they need. I mean, keep in mind, this was the end of the season. Most
Right.
kids are all college students are generally out for summer break. Fall, someone new could be coming in. And it was just unfortunate that Seabass did take his leave right there and then.
Yeah, so I'm thinking of like other teams kind of going into this. I think we saw a couple of teams. I hate to use the word underperform, but if we're being statistical here, I think there were some underperformances, right? I think Fisher College in particular coming in with kind of
Yeah.
an amalgamation of their traditional roster. How impactful do you think it was, Bass, in this kind of isolated performance that they played kind of like A, but kind of B, but kind of C roster?
How many adjectives are you going to let me have here? Because as many of them as I can dish against them, I'm pretty sure I'm going to come out with. The reality is that, unfortunately for Fisher, they are one of the top-ranked teams within CRL due to the fact that they have 3 straight-up professional players. You have Sosa, who plays for
Right.
Team Koi. You have Kinsei, who plays for M80. And then you have Money, their third, who used to play for Ghost Gaming, now plays on a couple of different rosters here and
Sup.
there. But Sup, thank you. That's the one. All 3 of those players, though, consistently make RLCS, which is the highest level of play in all of Rocket League. The issue is, when you try and take any roster that isn't that 3 roster, you're going to have expectations that are meteoric and unfortunately are very often not going to be able to be, lived up to, if that makes sense. And so
Right.
when you come in and Fisher are arguably one of the best teams in the entirety of the entire thing, and they don't even make it, I want to say competitive or even look like
Yeah.
a sort of shell of their former selves, it's very hard to justify giving them that sort of, what's the word here? Sort of respect. But again, you do have to take it with a little bit of an asterisk. This is not their main roster.
Yeah,
So as much as we want
right.
to judge their B squad here playing, it's not really fair to give the same expectations to them as we would their normal squad.
Yeah, absolutely. Chicksa, any familiar, kind of similar thoughts on just the Fisher appearance during this invitational?
Well, I mean, we're talking about the Collegiate Esports Commissioner Cup that was literally a week or
Yeah,
2
yep.
weeks beforehand, and that was the same
Yeah.
roster that played there. I also did get to interview them kind of in the back when we were doing some interviews, and they were as shy and as nervous as can be. When it comes to them in particular, I think it's a confidence issue. I think they're not used to playing against the competition of the best when it comes to CRL and the likes of the entire collegiate scene. They are new to it. They're still finding their way and they need to earn that same confidence in themselves to try to compete. Because if they're going to come into every match feeling like they're going to lose, like they don't have what it takes to fill in the shoes of that A roster, then they're going to struggle every single time. So, I
Yeah.
mean, they went 0-2. They went out really, really quick when it comes to this tournament in particular. They have a lot of time to grow. They are very young. Like I said, very
Yeah.
shy, but they need to figure out how do they become the likes of, the role models they have in that A team and the rest of the scene as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we throw it to our break very quickly, I do want to discuss 2 more teams that came into this. One, I know a heck of a lot more about than the other, but Boise and Oregon both coming into this. And I think both, I hate to say it, kind of also falling a little silent, falling a wee bit lackluster.
I think a lot of it is due to who the competition is here. I think that you do have to give a little bit of an asterisk to Boise. Boise is a team that statistically have done very well in a multitude of events. You look at CCC, the land that we had in Texas most recently, and they were able to actually even take down WVU, one of the top teams in all of Collegiate Rocket League, fronted by a player, an Angel, who, again, we talk about consistent RLCS mainstays. I don't think Angel has missed out on an RLCS event in probably like 3 or 4 events. That man has been making it to every single one with not just consistency, but absolute flair. He has been one of the best players in the bubble scene, which is basically the equivalent to the semi-pro scene when it comes to Rocket League in recent history. So it's a bit impressive to see them beat them, and then a little bit disappointing to then go and see them come into this and not perform well. But again, it's an asterisk. They end up losing to Akron Esports. They lose to them,
Twice.
go down to lower bracket, beat Oregon in the losers round 1, and then lose to Akron again. Same fashion as before, another 3-1 loss. But the thing is, for some reason, Akron is Boise's kryptonite. Boise performed well against a plethora of good teams within Collegiate Rocket League. The one team they seem to struggle against, though, is always Akron. I don't know what it is, but even at the CRO World Championship that we're talking about right now, they also just lost to Akron again in another 3-0 fashion. And it's not as if this is an uncommon thing, because again, these teams do face up against each other relatively often. It's just that you'd at least expect the results to go slightly a different way. Looking at the results that we have listed here on Wikipedia, 3 times in a row outside of this tournament, before coming into this tournament, these teams faced up against each other, and 3 times out of 3 times it has been a 3-0 sweep in favor of Akron. So again, Boise, you are not a bad team by any stretch of the imagination. Unfortunately, you just got the wrong matchup on the day, and for a team like this who really do need a good matchup considering their aggressive play style, this was not the one.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to agree with all of that as well. I mean, that Boise State roster being Durtho, Gill, and Instinct. I think, again, Boise State as a collegiate esports, kind of school, kind of newer to the scene. They have 3 phenomenal players. They're only getting better over time. I think it's, again, just a time thing for them as well. They're inconsistent when it comes down to it. They have really high highs, but kind of low lows when it comes to playing on the field. And if they can keep playing at the high level that we've seen them play before, Boise State's going to do really well in the long run. And I know they have great backing from their school, at least what we've seen as of recently.
Yeah, absolutely. Boise did not look as we wanted them to look here, but Chicks, you bring up the great point. They're a younger program. They're learning, and I have to agree, they continue to get better each time we see them. So they're a team we're going to be keeping an eye on throughout the next several seasons. But folks, we are going to go ahead and throw it to a short break here, so we'll see you right back with some more 2023 Esports Invitational action.
There were 2 guys. Neither guy wore their seatbelt. One guy got a ticket, one guy didn't. 2 guys drove home from work. One guy wore his seatbelt, one guy didn't. One guy made it home. One guy didn't.
Game world or real world, seatbelts save lives.
There were 2 guys. Neither guy wore their seatbelt. One guy got a ticket, one guy didn't. 2 guys drove home from work. One guy wore his seatbelt, one guy didn't. One guy made it home. One guy didn't.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to the 2023 ESPORTSU Invitational presented by NHTSA and Click It or Ticket recap show with Septilins, Chixa, and Bass to discuss all the Rocket League action that happened in this matchup so far. So we've talked a lot about kind of the matchups we did see, but a matchup we didn't see, and Bass, one that you actually kind of brought up earlier in the green room, is the fact that Indian River State College, the kryptonite of Northwood, somehow never clashed into them during this. If that did happen, how different do you think this bracket could have looked later on?
I think it definitely would have been a little bit of a different bracket. I do think that there has to be a little bit of an asterisk here. As much as IRSC are not necessarily the kryptonite for Northwood, they are the most competitive roster to that Northwood Blue roster. The only other roster that has been able to take a consistent amount of wins off of Northwood Blue is Northwood White. So it's the other team from Northwood that is able to stay competitive against them. Outside of those 2 rosters, no one else has really been able to take down this Northwood squad outside, like I said, of IRSC. Again, IRSC, though, they were sort of what's the word I'm looking for here? They were put into the Southern group here, and Southern ended up mixing in with East, so it's a little bit of a different vibe there. You don't necessarily get the same sort of matchups, and it's a little bit unfortunate. It's just the way that this one ends up working out, is that they don't end up getting those head-to-heads. They don't get a chance to play against them here, so it's just not what we were hoping for, I think is the best way to put it, because I would have loved to have seen that matchup there, but also at the same time, I don't know if it would have been as competitive, considering Disruptor was on that team instead of Seabass. Seabass is usually a lot of the reason that Northwood struggle, due to him being such an aggressive player that he does punish their mistakes on defense, something very few teams have actually been able to do in times past. So I'm a little bit sad that we didn't end up getting that matchup, but the matchups we did get, regardless of that, still ended up having way more upsets than I was expecting.
Yeah, and I think, Chicksa, you can kind of talk about this a little bit as well, is going into a very specific group of teams. You're looking at UTA, IRSC, Stockton, and Fisher. I think a lot of people would somewhat confidently say UTA would be slot number 4 in that circumstance in a lot of ways, but somehow they actually come out taking the top seed of that group. What is that expectation? What does that upset kind of provide for the rest of this bracket and the rest of what we saw?
Yeah, the East-South bracket, as we so called it, was certainly one filled with a lot of teams that have had similar kind of paths or different quality of play. But I mean, yes, you could arguably say UTA is the worst, but you could arguably say UTA has been the best at times when it comes down to it. They have been together a very long time. I mean, I believe this was kind of Samba's last hurrah, him being one of those retiring players that we have kind of mentioned. And Stockton, who has kind of been in this really hot and cold state. If we're going to talk about an inconsistent team, that they were up against in Stockton, I had named Top Cheese last year being like the MVP player of the entire collegiate scene, and then he had kind of fallen off with his team, and they just didn't look good when it started off this year. So I mean, I would arguably have put UTA above Stockton at that time. I think I probably predicted them over Stockton when we had done predictions in the earlier shows. It just comes down to who's feeling better on that day. If Fisher had their A roster, that could have shook up that entire bracket. If IRFC had Seabass, would have shook up the entire bracket. If Stockton was playing to their full potential, then they're the best of the best. And if UTA is playing as well as Samba can, then they're good. It all came down to the day of how everyone was feeling and what rosters were about for East-South.
So I'm very much a man of discussion and hypotheticals, right? Especially when you're looking at a bracket, there's always that back of mind what if. And the game that stands out for me in particular is the lower bracket round 2 IRSC versus Stockton. Going into that, say Seabass has not retired, do you think Stockton can still come out on top of that, or do you think Indian River can run away with that win and still find their spot into the top 4 bracket?
I don't think there's ever a world where Stockton win that matchup if that actually end up happening. I'm going to be honest, because this is actually parallels we have now seen multiple times throughout this. One of the biggest ones I think we really have to kind of highlight here is the fact that Stockton have kind of had a lot of what people like to call Mickey Mouse runs as of late. They've been able to just get a little bit easier of a bracket, a little bit easier of a path through. Even to the CRL World Championship, they ended up getting on the opposite side of the bracket as IRSC. IRSC had to go up against what is arguably the best team outside of CRL in St. Clair. They are a Canadian organization, or a Canadian, university that are really solid, really good at recruiting, have been pulling up a lot of really good teams. And then unfortunately, on the other side of that, IRSC faced them, Stockton faced Ball State. Not nearly the same sort of caliber of a team, not nearly the same sort of level. So it's a bit unfortunate that Stockton have just not really been able to prove themselves. And every time that they do get a chance to prove themselves against competition that people feel are, a fair competition to them, they always seem to fall underneath it. This is not the first time we've actually seen Stockton fall to UTA. UTA also took this matchup in the CECC Texas event that we had just a couple of weeks ago and actually knocked Stockton out of moving past the group stage. So this is one of these things where Stockton, push comes to shove, they always really have to perform and show themselves. And as much as they might have made it out of the group stage here over an IRSC who are a little bit weaker than their normal selves, I still think, unfortunately for Stockton, they didn't really prove themselves in this event. They might have made it to the playoffs, but we can talk about what happened post-playoffs for them if we wanted to.
Definitely. Looking at the matchup here in terms of this is something that I find fascinating outside of the scope of this specific event and goes more into the synergy and the dynamic of teams. We've hinted about it a lot. Seabass has kind of been our discussion topic for it, but a lot of teams are about to suffer this same problem of losing one of their core 3 players. So looking at teams fundamentally, not having to look at any team individually, how important is it when a team loses that? How drastic can that be for their success later on? What vulnerabilities kind of rise to the surface when a team loses a player like that?
I mean, if that is one of your key players that have been on a roster for 1, 2, 3 years, who knows how long a lot of these players have been playing with the same team? That's your entire dynamic that falls apart. Chemistry is what allows for the likes of, we'll say, Northwood every single time. They're clearly all professional players right now, kind of doing their own thing separately on their teams, but they come back every time and it's like they never stopped practicing. They are so familiar with one another. They've played so often with one another. They have that ease that they don't have to build up that chemistry. But if you lose an important part and you have to permanently try to place someone there, it's impossible. You're going to change how the team plays unless the 2 players were literally identical in style. You have to change how you work as 3 on the field. Maybe it's an entirely different dynamic. Maybe you turn into a more aggressive team or a more counterattacking team. There's so many different styles to play in Rocket League in particular, and depending on who you have on the field, who is mechanically adept as well. If you have someone who is just that good when it comes to utilizing their mechanics, then you're going to utilize them that way. So yeah, we have a lot of players that have, in a sense, retired. They've graduated from the collegiate scene. You only have really like a maximum of 4 years generally when it comes down to playing in it. You're going to have to continuously rotate. There's no players that stay that long.
Unless you're Buddy. Buddy is the only exception to this one. From
Buddy
what I've heard,
is the exception.
Yeah, from what I've heard, he's coming back to Northwood for a master's program. So maybe we see Buddy back in Collegiate Rocket League. Who really knows at this point?
I work in a couple. We know that I work in a couple of games across esports. Buddy will be the 4th player I've ever seen stay on a team longer than 4 years because they go back for a master's, because they go back for a second degree. It's a very rare thing that happens, but it is cool when you get to see it when a player is so passionate about A, their education, and B, the program they're a part of, that they choose to stick around. They want to keep playing. They want to keep performing. When you're as successful as Buddy's team continues to be, I wouldn't want to leave either. Like, you've got so much to prove. You've got so much to work with. If you can stick around, you may as well. And going into it, we can definitely, I think Buddy and Northwood would be a great example to discuss this next point I want to bring up, is how important is one player? So often when we're on the desk, when we're hosting, when we're casting, when we're discussing, we talk about, oh, synergy is critical, team play is important, but how far does one player go?
I would say pretty much the entirety of the way. You've seen teams completely revitalize themselves through one player, not just within collegiate, but in professional Rocket League as well. Right. And again, this is what makes Rocket League so unique, at least in my mind, is the fact that when you have only 3 players, every piece of the puzzle is a lot more important. Saying something like Overwatch, you've got 5 players. If one of the players is subbed out, obviously, that's not going to be great, but you can put in a new player, and that's only technically 20% of the roster being changed. Exactly. Similar to Valorant, similar to many other esports. In Rocket League, you take out one player, that is a third of the team completely gone, and you now need to try and completely redo the ways that you rotate, the ways that you play, the strategies you play with. Again, we said that with Seabass. Seabass, a very aggressive player, very front-heavy. If you don't have him in the team, someone has to either take up that role or you have to completely the entire rotations that you were focusing on. So there's a lot of importance to having that one player step up to the plate, and not only just having that one player step up to the plate, but being able to just recognize when a player is doing X role or doing Y rotation, and really being able to play around said rotations and roles, and being able to kind of fill in those gaps. I'm not too concerned for teams like Northwood, like IRSC, for finding a new third to fill into those roles. They have an whole off season at this point that they can work with, and again, both of those teams very good at recruiting. A lot of people don't know this is IRSC's 3rd team going into this next season. They actually had a team during summer last year they recruited. That team got banned from a bunch of events. Slayer, the only one not banned, came back, found an arguably better roster than the first time, and now he's got to find a replacement for Seabass. And most people are sitting here like, yeah, okay, yeah, sure, you're going to replace Seabass. If there's ever a player who I've got faith in to find an insane recruit out of nowhere, it is Slayer.
Slayer.
Yeah, and I love that. That actually leads so well into what I'm about to ask Chicksa here, is we've talked a lot about the cons of losing players. Are there any kind of hidden pros in replacing a player on the team? Is there any positives or net gains that can come from a situation like that?
I mean, there's a lot of really phenomenal young players in the scene. I
Yup.
mean, I'll go as well to say that I casted a middle school, high school event a couple of weeks ago. Middle school, keep in mind, there was these kids that were fantastic on the field, and I'm like, they're playing in their first tournament on Twitch. You know, the parents are so supportive. I wish
Yeah.
my parents were that supportive when I was 13 playing Rocket League, but it just starts so young now at this point. You have very young students that are getting the backing from schools, from their parents, participating in clubs, and it gets really competitive in the scene. I mean, we remember, of course, even professional scene, the Moist roster, Daniel as well, both all
Yes.
young pros, if you're talking about it. And imagine you pluck one of them and put them into the collegiate scene. They're very, very apparent. I think Bass may have one player in mind that you're thinking about as potentially someone coming into college, but yeah, there's a lot of really good talent that easily gets thrown into CRO.
We'll save that for later in the show. We got some time to
I
talk
was
about
gonna
that
say,
later.
And speaking of later, we're going to be talking about the Final Four bracket that we've been hinting about so much. 4 teams made it into the final couple of matchups, and there were some pretty insane games of Rocket League. But before we get to talk about that, we are going to go ahead and throw it to a break. We'll be right back with the 2023 ESPORTSU Invitational, brought to you by NHTSA and Click It or Ticket in just a minute.
Game world or real world, seatbelts save lives.
There were 2 guys. Neither guy wore their seatbelt. One guy got a ticket, one guy didn't. 2 guys drove home from work. One guy wore his seatbelt, one guy didn't. One guy made it home. One guy didn't.
Hey everybody, it's a super short break, but we've got a lot to talk about, so of course it's going to be a short one. We've talked about how you make it to the winners bracket, how you make it to those last 4 teams, and now we can talk about which 4 teams made it that far. If you were making a little bracket in your head, you might have figured it out by now, but the 4 teams that did make it were the Northwood Blue roster, the Stockton roster, who is a bit of that hot or cold. We can talk more about their performance. UTA Esports, a possible technical underdog, and the University of Akron. They all make it to that Final Four matchup, but guys, I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the grand finals discussion because it's on screen. I want to talk about it. Northwood wins in a 4-3 fashion over the University of Akron in a complete and total reverse sweep fashion. That is something we almost never see in best of sevens. That is, I would almost call that a historical moment to see something like that happen here.
I will give a huge shout out to my boy D-Rec. D-Rec is the official statistician for all of RLCS, as well as also he's got some stats that he works with for CRL as well. He is quite literally hired by Psyonix to keep track of stats. Fun fact, in the history of all of RLCS, there have been, I think, less than 20 reverse sweeps in a best of 7. It is very rare.
That's crazy.
Very rare to see that. When there are literally hundreds, if not thousands of series being played, it is an extreme rarity. The big one, though, that if I'm not incorrect on this, no one has ever done it in a grand finals. That's where this gets a little bit more spicy, is that you don't see this in grand finals. It is a extreme rarity. Many teams will get close. They'll get to game 7, and then they'll drop the ball when the pressure is on. And this is what makes Northwood different. This Northwood Blue roster just knows how to handle pressure. They are very good, and even when the tough gets going, they get tough. It is very hard for people to break this team down. Akron, I will say, is one of the best teams on the planet at doing that. Time and time again, they have proven themselves to be extremely competent when it comes to playing up against them. But as you guys will see here, I mean, this team is always close against Northwood. Akron and Northwood have a history of battling years and years and years in the making. Before it was Northwood and Akron, it was Akron and UNT. UNT kind of fell off a little bit, don't necessarily have the same caliber roster as before, and Northwood very happily took their place. This roster is incredibly prominent. I'm not surprised to see them coming out on top here, but in the fashion that they did, like you said, it can't help but be a surprise.
Yeah, and I've got to say, just out the gate, you know, Akron and Northwood, 2 of the elder gods of collegiate Rocket League, if you will. 2 teams that have been around for a while. They are incredible top dog performers. But something that I have found to be really interesting, I'm going to steal this from our friend Kilomiles, where Akron is a team that I think you could refer to as always the bridesmaid, never the bride, where they are constantly kind of meeting, okay, you've made it to top 4, okay, you've made it to grand final, but I can't recall the last time I saw Akron win a grand final. Is that something we should be worried about with this team moving forward? Is it kind of making it to the top but never kind of hitting the peak of the mountain? Or do you think they're still just as capable as they used to be?
Ooh, that's so hard because Akron, I mean, we've talked a little bit about them right now. They also have an A and a B roster that are playing equal. Kind of weird, but they went both 9-6, I believe, in the CRL season thus far. So they've been playing pretty equal. We talk about as well players leaving. Buzz, a very long-standing collegiate Rocket League player in particular, one with I believe some of the best stats that we've ever seen. I saw in a Twitter post someone made a little calling card for him, and he was like number 1 and 2 for overall stats. Overall. Throughout his time, I think just being so in the collegiate season. So Akron, I always said they're old school. They're the old school team. They were winning 4 years ago. They were the mark to beat, but yet they still haven't been able to officially get over that gap of Northwood. And I think with, again, Buzz leaving, there's still so much potential the A and B roster have to create a team of 3 that are really good, but they just haven't been able to at least be the beast of either of Northwoods at this point, or anyone else now, like such as Fisher, that has been at the top of the scene. Akron is had a hard time getting back on top, and I don't know if they can do it again with
this is so interesting.
Nature.
Yeah, this is so interesting that you bring this up, Chicks. I think anyone that knows me knows I'm a huge fan of Survivor, the TV show, right? It's something that I'm very passionate about. And in this show, you always hear the discussion, old school versus new school. And you bring that up, how the original first 10 to 20 seasons, the game was drastically different and played in a lot of different ways. But Bast, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. You look at Rocket League, the game itself has not fundamentally changed too much. So what does old school and new school mean in this sense versus something more apparent like Survivor, where the people know the game and the challenges change? Rocket League hasn't had that same kind of facelift. So how is it these old school teams seem to be falling short to the new school players?
One word in particular, mechanics. It has been one of the biggest changes that we've seen of Rocket League as of late, is that you're bringing out mechanics that you didn't think were in the game initially. So one of the ones you're going to probably see a couple of times in these replays, which you might have already seen a couple of times so far, is called a flip reset. It is when you are able to lock the bottom. No, not quite that. I thought they were going to go into one right there. But basically, being able to lock the bottom of your car onto the ball, when you do that, it resets your flip. You know, as the name suggests, you're able to basically get a flip reset and use that flip to your advantage while mid-air. Aerials, even in general, are a more newer concept. In the original seasons, aerials were around, but when they happened, they were pretty big deals. Now, you're basically seeing battles in the air, 50-50 after 50-50 from team just locking into flip resets and consistently being able to put solid shots on to follow up. I mean, look at what we just saw there. Defense like that, due to shots off the backboard, teams being able to double touch it, as it is called, was not an original thing when Rocket League was first coming up with its professional scene. As time went on, players were able to utilize those abilities a little bit more. And while you have players like Tristan, one of the players on Akron, who's been around since the beginning of CRL with multiple national championships under his belt, it's a bit of a different game now. The mechanics have leveled up a little bit. The rotations are a little bit more aggressive. Teams aren't as hesitant to try and go into the air, like I said. And teams are also a lot more demo heavy. It's not necessarily a brand new mechanic, but it's a mechanic that's utilized a lot more than in its original season. So its evolution of the game, basically, is the best way to put it. And as much as old school still does exist, there are very much a lot of old school who can still compete with the best of the best. The big issue is, like you said, there's young players that you've never heard of who have put 14,000 hours into free play, who are now just of age to play in collegiate, who are just coming through and clapping everybody. There will be more next year. There are ones this year. We talk about that Akron program, and although they do have Buzz retiring, they have a lot of other people coming in. Patty and Jonathan are two of the best scouted players in all of collegiate Rocket League right now. People have extremely high expectations for that duo, so no matter what route Akron goes with, they are going to have a fantastic team. That being said, I actually found the post that Chixa was talking about, just to go a quick little recap of how good Buzz is overall. Goal participation first all time, goals first all time, assists first all time, saves, this is the lowest one on the list, 4th all time for collegiate Rocket League, averaging just underneath 400 points a game, 158,000 total points through his games played is 2nd all time, and 109 MVPs makes him the 1st overall for that as well. On top of all that, 4-time CRL champion. This kid knows how to win. That's just it.
I want to touch that. Like you said 158,000 1,000 goals?
No, points. Points all time.
Okay.
Points all time.
I was like, hold on. I was like, that's insane.
It's a little bit much. That's a little too far.
I was like,
But
that's a lot. That's a very high
just
number.
in collegiate play. That is
Yep.
just
Collegiate
in
alone.
Cyril. That's just in Cyril. Keep in mind, he's probably played a plethora of other things.
Right.
But that is
right.
just his stats in CRL, which is outstanding. And when I read that post, I was like, man, Buzz has made leaps and bounds in the scene. And the fact is, Akron is still a good roster, but with even all of that backing up, the majority of it was in the past 4 years at the beginning of those years and not recently where Northwood has been dominating instead that space. So it's wild to think that Buzz may have all of those accolades, but yet he is no longer, well, I mean, I'd say he's still in the top of the scene, but he's no longer in that top that they once were.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you bring up, I think this kind of meshes in well to the point being brought up that Akron, fun fact, is about 20 minutes from my hometown. It is from Ohio. I'm from Ohio. So I'm very familiar with the school. I'm very familiar with the program. And I know it is the oldest collegiate esports program in the country. So when you're talking about, old school, they are literally the old school. So it goes to this kind of showing point of they've been around, like you mentioned, the first CRL. They have been around ever since the beginning of collegiate esports because in a lot of ways, they were the beginning of collegiate esports. Do you guys feel like the Northwood versus Akron matchup could be a good representation of old school versus new school, and how I would argue Northwood might play a little bit of a newer play style, and they were able to snipe out that 7th game win? Do you think it's because they have those better mechanics? Do you think it's because they're finding faster demolitions and faster gameplay? Or was there something about Northwood? Was it just a Northwood diff that allowed them to find this reverse sweep?
Interesting.
I think it's old school, new school mechanics. I mean, Lion Blaze, you could arguably say, is one of the best players in the world right now, in a sense. He hasn't shown himself too much in the professional scene, but still he's doing quite well professionally. But when it comes to in Collegiate Rocket League, probably the best mechanically, one of the best ones players you have ever seen. I have a clip in my head that I kind of remember of me casting him where he 1v3s the entire team with his own mechanics.
That's just a Lion Blaze moment.
Yeah. That is literally, yes, a Lion Blaze moment. And he is as new school as it gets when it comes to being confident on the field and utilizing those mechanics. He flip resets the best of them, double taps, every mechanic you could possibly say. Lion Blaze has probably done it.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that one. And I think that this conversation is only one we can have this year, though. Again, Akron, you have to give a lot of credit to them. They are really good at scouting. Like we said, they have multiple different players that they have coming in next year that they could slot into this roster any which way. Who knows what their main roster is going to be, the Akron Blue roster, if you will. They have Akron Gold as their A, or Akron Gold as their B, and Akron Blue as their A. I don't know why people don't just say A and B teams and why we have to keep on using colors. Northwood Blue does the exact same thing, and it's so frustrating. Regardless, point being here, though, this is a conversation we can really only have this year due to the fact that it is a historied roster, and it's actually a historied roster that is interesting because Akron did try to make changes. Beginning in fall in CRL, they actually substituted out Bullseye, one of the veterans for the squad, and put in Patty instead. That roster didn't do great. It didn't do poorly by any stretch of the imagination, but it didn't really live up to the expectations. Then all of a sudden, they end up switching it out, put back in Bullseye, and the team goes back to new heights while they let Patty and Jonathan, I would say, sort of develop so that they were prepared for their next year. Similarly, though, that is kind of, like you said, old school. Keeping the roster that has rotations, that is very chemistry-based, that is very sound when it comes to their confidence, versus a Northwood who are more confident, I would say, in whatever iteration that they have. Going into next year, I have, like I said, talked to a multitude of people there about the recruits that they have upcoming, and they're playing to basically just roster shuffle all around. They don't really care. Even if Buddy's coming back, he doesn't get a guaranteed spot on the main roster. He could be on the B roster. He could be a coach. Who knows what he could be? That school is based on experimentation, finding what is the best pattern for these guys and working with it. When Lion Blaze was first there, he was not known as the king of that team. It was T. Carell when he was on that team. It was T. Carell and Noxus who had a lot more experience. Slowly, people realized Lion Blaze is the guy to beat. And as time has gone on, he is the only remaining member of that prior CRL championship team that took down Bay State a couple of years ago. So, it's interesting to see how this has continued to develop and how we continue to mix so much. But I still think that Lion Blaze is probably one of the best out there. No matter who they put around him, he will be the king of the new school for a long time to come.
And before we kind of jump into the standouts and the roster swaps, because that's personally my favorite category that we're going to be getting to, I do want to talk a little bit about Stockton and UTA, the teams we talked about making it to top 4 that obviously do not make it to top 2. So Stockton is able to beat UTA in a Game 6 4-2 victory. I think the first question, I'm going to be honest, I know UTA historically, I don't know their current roster. I know they're kind of, I think, a classified old school team.
Yep.
Would you guys call Stockton kind of a new school team? Do you think that's another similar situation of Stockton just having that mechanical difference, or is there more to the story there? I'm genuinely asking as I do not know the answer. So if you guys have any insight on this.
I mean, Stockton in this sense is a new school team just because they haven't been around the CRL scene that long.
Sure.
I mean, they're newer players. I know Anthony Pizza came in for someone else. Yes, for someone else on that Stockton roster of Top Cheese and Bussy, who have been here a little bit longer. Top Cheese, again, the more notable player, and as for
Definitely.
UTA, Adverse Nava Samba, you know, they've been there. They've been that roster for as long as I can personally remember casting them. I don't think they've really.
Yeah, I started casting Rocket League 3 years ago, and they were the roster of my very first game. So they have been around for a while.
So they have been that roster. You can consider them old school, but when it comes to mechanics and stuff like that, Samba looks familiar with them. He is very much upfield in the air, utilizing his mechs when it comes down to it. A team that radiates a lot of confidence. I think kind of different from Akron, who sometimes to me seems a little bit shy, especially when it comes to going into those Northwood matches. So
that's very valid.
Yes, UTA possibly an old school team, but I think they've done well to adapt over time to fight with the best of them and learn how to be a little bit more of the quote unquote new school, and then Top Cheese and the rest of them on Stockton in that third place matchup. New school, again, I said they were very high highs and then low lows when it comes down to it. So I think when it came down to Stockton in this third place matchup, it was also kind of a rematch. They had played previously. They finally had their high game. They played really well as a team. They were able to beat in game number 6 in our third place matchup.
Yeah, I love that. And Bass, before we throw it to a break, any quick final thoughts on Stockton or UTA's performance?
I think it's it's glad to see the rivalry go down at least one last time. These are two teams that both have seniors that are going to be graduating and no longer playing within Collegiate Rocket League. So it's good to see that these guys at least get one last matchup. And hey, for Stockton, glad that they were able to take the final win there, because I'm pretty sure that if they had gone 3 losses in a row back to back against UTA, Samba would literally never let Bussy hear the end of it. So at least he gets a little bit of a jab back at him. He can kind of poke and be like, you might have taken me overall, but I got the final laugh. So, I don't know. I'm glad to at least see one last matchup there. Congratulations to Stockton for taking third place.
Definitely Stockton in that third place slot. And folks, when we get back from this quick break, the most opinionated section of the day will be coming up. Standout players, roster swaps, and MVPs all on the other side of this break. We'll see you right in a few.
Game world or real world, seatbelts save lives.
There were 2 guys. Neither guy wore their seatbelt. One guy got a ticket, one guy didn't. 2 guys drove home from work. One guy wore his seatbelt, one guy didn't. One guy made it home. One guy didn't.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the 2023 ESPORTSU Invitational presented by NHTSA and Click It or Ticket recap show. Sutherland's Chicksa and Bass on the mic. And now we get to talk about my clearly favorite section of the day, the standouts, the MVPs, and the roster swaps we're going to be seeing in the future. So the first thing I'm going to hone in on, because standout sounds like a positive word, and it does not always have to be, I want to jump back to one of our earliest conversations of the day. Disruptor for IRSC, a standout player, possibly in a negative way. A game dropping 43 points, and not in a good way. I'm talking full overall score of 43. So not something we see super often. Do we think that performance is an indicator of the future? Was this first game nerves? Was this something the team needs to be worried about? What needs to change from this team to make sure things like that aren't happening in the future?
Disruptor? That Disruptor needs to change. I think that they just need to, unfortunately, get him off of the roster. As much as Disruptor is a great player and he is not a bad person, and I have no beef with him whatsoever. I think it is very clear that IRC do not intend on keeping him within that starting role. Having conversations with Slayer, him and I go back and forth pretty often. He's often in my Twitch chat telling me a little bit about, all the little intricacies of how he's building this new roster. And from what I've heard, they've had a plethora of different options at this point, but they're looking to go for, a surprise pick, if you will. He's going for somebody a little bit new, and I'm not going to give, too many little hints about who it could be, but I have faith, like I said, this guy knows how to build a really good roster, and I have faith that if Disruptor is not the choice, they will find somebody to be able to take over that role that Seabass has left. So I don't want to really, poo-poo upon Disruptor too much here. I think I'd like to give him his ups. He stepped up at the time where Seabass was not available, was able to at least play to the most competitive level that he could, but I don't think that is the future for IRSC here. I think they are very much more focused on trying to find a new teammate in that new third, and I'm hoping that they are going to find somebody that really fits that role well. I think he is, a player that, while maybe didn't perform on the day, there's no reason to bash upon Disruptor overall. He had to be at the place. There was no other option really for that team. It's either play with Disruptor or don't play at all. So for IRSC, props to Disruptor for at least stepping up.
Yeah, and I've got to say, I think I'm comfortable harping on IRC Lex. I got to spend a lot of time with them in Texas at CECC. I got to know the team very well, and I know that they're the type of team that can understand criticism and not take it in a negative way. They're a team looking to improve, looking to change. I think that's why we're allowed to be so honest about this, is because they fully understand, they fully agree. And Chixa, looking to IRSC, they've got an incredible roster with a massive hole in the wall right now. Do you think that is going to be changing? Are you with Bass on the side of maybe it's not Disruptor's time quite yet?
Yeah, I would have to agree with it. I mean, Disruptor, across the board, like I said, about half the points of both of his teammates throughout the games he played. He had one good game of like 782 points. He had almost all 3 goals and whatnot. So he didn't have the consistency that he needed, and we know Slayer's in chat right now. We'll shout him out. He's listening. We're not gonna dive too deep. Bass won't spoil his secrets, as we mentioned, but there's definitely Disruptor is more of a sub role that he'll continue to take on. I think he's a good face for IRSC. I see him on Twitter quite often. I know he's very involved with the team when it comes down to it, and it's nice to have that support or sometimes that player that is, I don't want to say cheerleader because that sounds rude, but is just supportive of the teammates and the entire program of a whole. I think Slayer and Taco Stash a very great base. We mentioned how well Slayer is as a player on the field. I also got to meet his parents while at CECC. I know they're very supportive of him as well. Yes, they were very wonderful. So with all of that combined, I think IRSC has a very bright future when it comes to esports.
Yeah, and speaking of bright futures, to move a little bit away from IRSCs, they've been quite a hot topic in this just 1 hour. We've talked about them a lot, but a player that I think is a personal MVP and standout of mine comes from Northwood, and it's Nitrous from the team there. It's something that I'm surprised that we're hearing might not be a starter next year, a player that I feel like we're not seeing enough of, because every time that kid touches the field, I am blown away. I want to hear your guys' thoughts on this as well. I think when it comes to MVPs, he's got to be up there, no doubt about it.
He was MVP for this event in particular, but I think the big issue they have with Nitrous is he's very young. He's a freshman right now, and on a roster like that, you really do need veteranship. Right, isn't it? He's been around RLCS and competitive play. Right? Like, he's been around for forever. He's been getting into RLCS before he was even a collegiate player. So he is a very good player with a lot of future to him. But the issue is, again, he hasn't always been able to prove himself in those clutch moments. Granted, he did it at CCC, he did it here, didn't do it at the CRL World Championship. Unfortunately, that team is actually not going to make an appearance in the top 8. They ended up losing to an EU team in Hamburg. Not the biggest upset ever when you look at the roster that Hamburg that was there, but it is a good team regardless that shouldn't necessarily be losing those matchups when you have them on paper as one of the best NA has to offer. So Nitrous is an extremely solid player. I think he deserves all his flowers when it comes to this event in particular. He was the biggest impact player in terms of individual time spent on the ball, just in general. I mean, again, looking at his stats overall, you can really understand where this player was a breakout star in comparison to his 2 teammates. 0.91 assists per game average, just underneath an assist per game. And when you have a player like Lion Blaze who is scoring 1.4 goals a game, that's how you have to play. You don't have to be the star. You just have to be able to be at the right moments and have a hot hand and know when to dish it. It is one of my favorite phrases in all of Rocket League, is that if someone has the hot hand, just keep throwing it to them because they will continue to spike it on net. And that's what Nitrous's role was here, is that he doesn't need to be the star. He doesn't need to outshine Lion Blaze. He needs to let Lion Blaze fly, and he needs to be the best support to his wings possible. And that's why I really think Nitrous, like you said, is kind of my MVP for this whole tournament. The kid is playing his role perfectly, and if he continues to play like this, he's got an incredibly bright future within collegiate.
Keep in mind,
Absolutely.
subbing him for Buddy as well, who originally started in our group stages, but ended up not being able to play brackets. But you know what? As we said, that Northwood entire esports org has plenty of players to put in place. Nitrous, a very good pick to do so, to work well with Lion Blaze and hockey.
So I've got one more player that I wanted to talk about, and you guys did maybe kind of accidentally steal my thunder a little bit, but I didn't warn you I was going to talk about Buzz from Akron. So you guys threw this all out earlier, but I think Buzz is so clearly a no-brainer player, just an MVP of the collegiate space, one of statistically the greatest players of all time. And even going into this, I mean, I think left his heart on the field all the way through a grand final game 7.
I agree. I think that Buzz has proven himself to consistently be one of the best out there. And as much as people really like to, I would say, sort of undermine his performances and really don't give him his due credit, I think that you need to. Like we said, he's just been so good for so incredibly long. He's a staple of the scene at this point, and you don't become a staple by just hosting. There's many players who have been around for a very long time who aren't really got the same sort of reputation that Buzz has. But Buzz consistently, every time that people look at Akron, they go, is this the time that Buzz finally falls off? And then he doesn't. And it consistently turns into that conversation. So, hey, listen, support Buzz his entire career. He deserves all the praise in the world. This man may have been graduated now, but he still has to kind of conclude everything. Like we said, this is really a good sort of test for Worlds. This was a great preview for Buzz to get a little bit of extra confidence, because if he can take Northwood to 7 in grand finals, who's to say that he can't get to a grand finals in the CRL World Championship?
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe.
Yeah, I think Buzz is a very fun player. But before we go ahead and close things out, is there any players in particular that we didn't talk about? Anybody, you guys, any teams you guys just want to give a little bit of a spotlight, a little bit of shine to discuss either that team's future, that player's performance, or anything that we didn't get the chance to talk about in this, what turned out to be very content-packed hour?
Honestly, best thing that I can say here is to just take one more look at this broadcast. If you guys haven't already seen it, it's going to be up on the ESPORTSU channel. Please do go back and watch, because it might be the last time you were able to see these teams compete as these trios. Going into next year, I don't think there's a single roster that participated in this that is not going to have a completely different roster going into next year. Every single one of them is going to have to make changes in at least some way. I think the only one who may not need to is going to be Fisher College. But as we also stated before, Fisher didn't really show up with the main roster that they normally play with. So again, take a look at these rosters, take a good long gander, and recognize that there are going to be changes into the next year. If you want a quick top 3, I think, of teams to sort of watch out for that are going to be making these changes, pay attention to Northwood. Like we said, they are an incredibly prominent team who, no matter who they pull in as their third, which, by the way, it's not a secret, their new third is going to be Zanil. If you guys know who Zanil is, yeah, you can understand why that's impactful. So Zanil going to Northwood. Indian River State, we don't know who their third is, so pay attention to that team. You know, speculate along with us. Hop on Twitter at ESPORTSU if you guys want to, get involved in the conversation. And then Boise State. Boise has announced their 2 new pickups in Preston and Boozy.
Yes.
But from what I have heard, talking to both Doc Antle, their coach, as well as the players themselves, there's not a guaranteed spot for Preston nor Woozy. If Instinct or Gil can hold on to their spot, they get a mainstream spot next roster next year. So it's going to be an absolute dogfight there to see who is going to come out on top. In my opinion, I could absolutely see a world where Instinct retains his spot. That kid is absolutely disgusting. And if he does it right, he'll beat out Woozy or Preston. So again, pay attention to those 3 rosters. They have got a lot coming in this next year. And honestly, so does all of Collegiate Rocket League. It's a great time for collegiate esports.
Chicks, any final closing thoughts?
I don't know if I can get better words than what Bash just said. That was pretty freaking good of an ending. But I mean, yeah, this was an absolute fantastic kind of filler between CCC and CRL. You could call it filler, you could call it practice, you could call it whatever it was. It was a really great way for the players to be involved for those last hurrahs. So thanks so much to NHTSA, of course, and ESPORTSU for allowing the players to have another opportunity to play, because as we said, these rosters will not be the same next year. So they got one last chance especially if they didn't make Worlds, which is this weekend, to just put it all out on the field. This game has a phenomenal community when it comes down to it. These players are really close with one another, and you can't get any better. Collegiate Rocket League, I always say, holds my heart. Zanil, I'm so excited to see him in CRL. I casted him as a bubble scene caster like way long ago when I started. I know Bass, you did the same.
Grind.
Yep. So a lot of these players that we kind of noticed in the shadows are here. They're playing. Watch all the new talent. Collegiate is only going to continue to grow more and more over time.
I love it, Chicks. I love everything you say there. I think a collegiate esports exodus is coming, and a lot of great teams are going to change, and they're going to be different. I think it's all going to be for the better. Bass, I think you crushed the point. Boise, a team that I love and go way back with. Things are changing in the best way, and it's going to be a dogfight through and through for them. This has been a blast of a recap. This has been a great event. Thank you to all the teams that came out and made this possible. Thank you to both NHTSA and Click It or Ticket. Buckle your seatbelt to make it home safely. Don't risk it. Paid for by NHTSA. So a big shout out to NHTSA and Click It or Ticket. Thank you two for joining me and chatting with me. Chatting with two others is way better than sitting here by myself for an hour. So this has been a great time. I've had a wonderful discussion. We all love Rocket League. We hope all of you do as well. If you're watching, we assume you do. And the drought between CECC and CRL was filled by what turned out to be an incredible event. Thank you all so much for watching. Check your posture, drink some water. Don't forget to love each other, and we'll see you on the next one.
Game world or real world, seatbelts save lives.
There were two guys. Neither guy wore their seatbelt. One guy got a ticket, one guy didn't. Two guys drove home from work. One guy wore his seatbelt, one guy didn't. One guy made it home. One guy didn't.